In 2014, almost a decade before his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia's President Vladimir Putin ordered an illegal and aggressive takeover of the Crimean Peninsula. Ever since, experts have debated exactly what the reasoning behind this move was. Some argue it was a simple power play. Others suggest it was the start of Putin's push to reclaim territories he felt belonged to him. Or a simple distraction, a way to get the Russian people back on side and shift their focus away from corruption, economic problems, and other issues. Now, the truth of why Russia occupied Crimea may have finally been revealed, courtesy of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who believes he's figured out exactly what Putin's been planning all along. The annexation of the Crimean Peninsula took place in early 2014, shortly after the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, which involved intense clashes between protesters and state forces in the country's capital of Kyiv, culminating in the president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, being ousted from his position. Russia deployed special forces into Crimea, ordering them to quickly capture important sites across the peninsula, including the Crimean parliament buildings. The existing government was kicked out and replaced with a pro-Russian one, before a highly controversial and contested referendum took place, in which the Crimean people, according to Russian authorities, overwhelmingly voted to join Russia. Many countries around the world have classed that referendum as invalid and in breach of Ukraine's constitution and sovereignty. But none of that appears to matter to Russia, as it has since gone on to militarize the peninsula and exert total control over the area. At the time of the annexation, Putin gave a lengthy speech in which he outlined the reasons behind his decision. He claimed that Crimea was always part of Russia, stating, "In people's hearts and minds, Crimea has always been an inseparable part of Russia. This firm conviction is based on truth and justice and was passed from generation to generation over time under any circumstances, despite all the dramatic changes our country went through during the entire 20th century." Putin also attempted to argue that Russia was coming to aid and protect its people in Crimea, who were allegedly under threat in the wake of the protests and revolutionary movement. The residents of Crimea and Sevastopol turned to Russia for help in defending their rights and lives, in preventing the events that were unfolding and are still underway in Kyiv, Donetsk, Kharkov, and other Ukrainian cities. Naturally, we cannot leave this plea unheeded. We cannot abandon Crimea and its residents in distress. The Russian leader also suggested that Ukraine was attempting to join the NATO alliance, bringing NATO warships worryingly close to Russia's shores. All of this, he claimed, was the reasoning behind the decision to enter Crimea and make it a part of Russia. Of course, Putin is an expert in propaganda. He's leaned on lies and falsehoods throughout his time in power, constantly twisting the truth to suit his own agenda. We've seen it happen countless times, which is why Putin's word means so little. World leaders saw yet another example of this recently, when Putin met with US President Donald Trump and appeared willing to make some concessions and perhaps even agree to a peace deal before resuming large-scale strikes on Ukraine. The Russian president knows exactly what to say to get people on side or excuse his outrageous actions. He also knows that, within Russia, he holds the power, so can effectively get away with doing whatever he wants, making up any excuses that seem to fit the narrative, and moving on to his next grand plan. As such, Putin's explanations for capturing Crimea cannot be taken at face value. The bigger picture must be considered, examining what Russia did after taking control of the Crimean Peninsula to fully understand why it made that decision in the first place. And if there's one man who has followed Russia's actions closer than anyone else in recent years, it's Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian president recently sat down for an interview with French magazine Le Point. During that interview, he was asked about a possible end to the war and whether or not Ukraine would have to eventually agree to give up territories, such as Crimea, to bring about a state of peace. This is something that's been brought up on numerous occasions whenever discussions of ceasefires or peace agreements have taken place. American President Donald Trump, for example, has urged Zelensky to make concessions, recently posting on Truth Social, "President Zelensky of Ukraine can end the war with Russia almost immediately if he wants to, or he can continue to fight. Trump went on to say that Zelensky would have to agree to let Russia keep Crimea and abandon any intentions of ever joining the NATO alliance in the future. There have also been talks of proposed land swap agreements between Kyiv and Moscow in order to bring about an end to the war. Zelensky has, however, rejected any notion of ceding Ukrainian soil to Russia. He recently wrote on social media, "Russia should not be rewarded for its participation in this war, and it's Moscow that must hear the word stop." And when asked by Le Point if Ukraine should agree to cede territories like Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, Zelensky was unequivocal in his response. These people, with all due respect, do not fully understand what Russia wants or what it's capable of.
Why did Russia take Crimea? Was it only about land? Was it only about pride? Or was there something deeper, something the world has refused to admit? This is not just a story of borders and soldiers. This is a story of history, betrayal, oil, water, and survival. And tonight, you will finally understand the true reason why Russia occupied Crimea. Back in February 2014, the world watched in shock as Russian troops disguised without insignia, known as the Little Green Men, flooded into Crimea. In less than 3 weeks, Moscow had seized the peninsula and declared it part of the Russian Federation. The international community cried foul, sanctions were imposed, but Russia did not back down. For many, it seemed like an impulsive act of aggression, Vladimir Putin's sudden grab for power. But the truth is far more complex. The seeds of Crimea's occupation were sown decades earlier, and the world ignored the warning signs. Let us go back to 1954. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev made a symbolic gesture, transferring Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. At the time, it seemed meaningless. Ukraine and Russia were both part of the Soviet Union. But after the USSR collapsed in 1991, this decision would come back to haunt history. When Ukraine declared independence, Crimea became part of the new Ukrainian state. Yet the majority of its population remained ethnically Russian with strong cultural, linguistic, and political ties to Moscow. This was the first crack. For Russia, Crimea was never just another territory. It was home to the port city of Sevastopol, headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, Russia's gateway to the Mediterranean. Whoever controls Crimea controls not only the Black Sea but also influence over the Middle East, Southern Europe, and beyond. The Russian Navy had leased bases in Crimea from Ukraine after 1991, but it was an uncomfortable marriage. Moscow always feared that one day Kyiv could cancel the deal, leaving Russia blind in the south. This was not paranoia. In the early 2000s, NATO expanded eastward. Former Soviet states like Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia joined the alliance. Russia watched as its sphere of influence shrank. Then came talk of Ukraine itself joining NATO. For Moscow, that was the ultimate red line. If Ukraine joined NATO, Russia would lose Crimea and with it, Sevastopol. American and European warships could replace Russian ones. For Putin, this was unthinkable. Crimea was not just about land, it was about survival of Russia as a great power. But there was another layer. Few people talk about it openly: Crimea's natural resources. Beneath the Black Sea lie vast reserves of oil and natural gas. Whoever controls Crimea controls the ability to drill, extract, and transport this wealth. In 2013, just a year before Russia's occupation, Ukraine signed deals with Western companies like ExxonMobil and Shell to explore these reserves. For Moscow,